Hola, cage fighting connoisseurs. You're in for a treat today. This is Kid Native Bloody Elbow, joined for a very special MMA Tete-A-Tete by Brian D'Souza and John S. Nash. We are going to be talking about the Reebok deal, UFC's mega blockbuster $70 million deal to put the fighters in uniform, impose uniformity on the chaotic world of mixed martial arts. The end of the bad boys, the tap outs, the afflictions, the condom depots, the deluxe fasteners, all that crap. It's gone. It's all corporate. It's Reebok, baby. This is going to be big. Dana White and Lorenzo Fertitta promise that all the money is going to go, every penny of this deal is going to go to the fighters. Some of the fighters not so happy. Of course, some of the fighters, Ronda Rousey, got to participate in designing the uniform. She's excited. Forrest Griffin's retired, but he says it's great. It'll save the fighters all the trouble of having to scrounge around on their hands and knees looking for sponsors. However, Greg Jackson, the coach, says it's going to cost him money, but it's good for the fighters, and that's ultimately what it's all about. However, retired UFC contender Nate Quarry says it's a bad deal for the fighters, and the CEO of Dethrone, the apparel company, has some very interesting comments we'll get to. But first, Mr. Nash, introduce yourself, tell the audience who you are, why they should care, and quick thoughts on the uniform deal as a general proposition. I mean, I know I should introduce you, but it's just not going to happen. So
yeah, you don't even know who the hell I am. So, I'm John Nash. I write occasionally for Bloody Elbow when I get the energy to do so. I guess my Twitter handle is Hey Not the Face at Twitter. And I don't even know what the deal is yet. So no
what
one
do you
knows
mean
the
you don't know what
details.
the deal is? You saw Dana White and Lorenzo Fertitta and the head of, or some dude from Reebok, I don't think it was the head of Reebok, come out and say it was good things. It was big things.
Well, yeah,
Garrett Davies said it was a $70 million deal.
But 70 million was reported. It didn't come from Dana or Reebok. That 70 million was reported from another media member who heard it from somewhere. So we don't know the full amount. We don't know the actual. Is there more involved than just the uniform deal? Is Reebok paying extra to the UFC to get maybe in-cage advertising or on, for another sponsor deal, a side deal? Did they use the fighter uniform deal to get an extra deal and make some extra money on that? Is there going to be future logos put on that uniform that will not be split with the fighters? The fighters get a
And
split
that's
of
a
those
key
future
point, and
ones?
we'll get to that.
So there's a lot. Does the 20%? Does the 20% that the fighters are going to collect from the royalties of their own kits sold? Does that come from profits? Is that gross? Is that net? Is it from what the UFC gets from Reebok?
Sounds
looking
like
for answers.
you sound like one of those troublemaking accountants that
Yeah.
corporate overseers don't let in the offices. Mr. D'Souza, introduce yourself and give
Um,
us a quick summary of your thoughts on the deal.
all right, well, I'm Brian D'Souza, author of Pound for Pound, The Modern Gladiators of Mixed Martial Arts.
If I could
Uh,
remember the title of the book, I would have done the introductions yourself. I have to say it is the best book on the business of MMA written yet today. Go ahead.
right on. And, for me, sponsorship, it's a huge part for the athletes, not just in terms of, like the money, it's part of their identity, and it's something that they're proud of that signifies they've arrived at success. So what's happening here is a huge like betrayal of spirit, of the individualism of MMA, of the control of an individual fighter's mentality. We got a sport that's supposed to be anti-corporate. It's supposed to be about freedom, but it's not. It's the complete opposite. It's
Who
indentured
said it was
servitude.
supposed to be anti-corporate or supposed to be about freedom?
That's what I think of when I think of fighting.
I
I,
see.
I,
So one man against another man or one woman against another woman, and that makes you think it's some kind of free living libertarian paradise, huh? Well, Father Dana and Uncle Lorenzo have a different vision. They've been getting increasingly corporate. I think Nate Quarry summed it up best. That when he came into the UFC, which has been a little over 10 years ago, they were told, hey, we don't pay a lot, but you can get whatever sponsors you want, cut whatever deals, keep all the money. You'll get exposed on the pay-per-views on Spike TV. Good deal. Then a couple years later, it comes along, hey, we're not happy with a lot of the sponsors we're getting. Sponsors are going to have to pay a sponsor tax to the UFC. It's going to be 6 figures. And that immediately cleared out tons of the riffraff from the UFC sponsorship business. And according to the fighters, some of the fighters, it dramatically, it hurt their chances of getting sponsors. From the UFC's perspective, it meant you had a lot less condom depot and a lot less random, trashy looking stuff in the octagon as they, feature themselves on Spike TV and now on Fox, FX, Fox Sports 1. They want to be corporate. They want to be accepted. They want to be professional. They want to cut big deals. If this deal is anything close to $70 million, as has been reported by Gareth Davies, then this is going to be the third biggest revenue stream in the UFC. So right now, number one is television rights. This is a big change from the pay-per-view driven business that they've had for a decade or more now. First up, it's pay-per-view rights. It's the Fox deal. It's the Globo deal in Brazil. It's the Televisa deal in Mexico. Second will be pay-per-view numbers. And then third will be corporate sponsorships, Reebok, but obviously Harley-Davidson, Bud Light, other companies they've cut in. So in some ways, this is a big positive for MMA. I mean, this is a sport that was thrilled to have Tap Out selling T-shirts out of the back of the trunk of their car 10 or 15 years ago, and now they're cutting deals with Reebok. It's not Nike, but this is big doings. John, do you think that this is a betrayal? I mean, is Brian talking crazy pants? Is this a betrayal of everything MMA stands for, or is this something that's got good and bad side, and there's some upside for some fighters, or is this just all bad?
Well, it's good for the UFC, and so for them it's great. And I think actually the 2009 when they implemented the sponsor tax is very informative because it's very similar to that. There's a lot of arguments. People argue that this is going to be great for the fighters, and hey, maybe it will. Maybe when the details come out, they'll make a fortune, and this will be the best thing ever. But if you look at what happened when fighters handed over their image rights for the video game, when the sponsor tax was implemented.
And let's give some background on that. That's a deal where, and this is something they cut John Fitch over briefly when he was a top contender in the welterweight division. Yeah. They added a right to the contract that said, we own your image rights in perpetuity. You don't get a payment for this. That there was some, my understanding at least, there's some vague promise of profit sharing. But basically this means they can put the fighters' images into video games, profit off those deals forever, and pay the fighters whatever they feel like paying him if they feel like paying him, and the fighter can't then be in a different video game if he moves to a different company down the road. All right.
Well,
so
we see what some of them made. I mean, Carlos Condit in that lawsuit over his tattoo was revealed he made $21,500 on appearing in all three versions of the THQ video game.
And that was the original UFC.
Yeah.
Disputed, I want to believe was the name of that.
Whatever. I don't play it. I don't know. But it was popular.
Yeah.
It sold a ton.
And that was over
a
set period of years.
Yeah, but that was over 3 different versions over 3 years. So it sold $400 million worth, whatever. UFC probably, or $200 million. UFC collected $60 million, something like that, off it. But Carlos Condit made $21,500. Compare that to the guys that were signing the EA Sports video game rights, which was competing with them and bombed horribly. I've talked to managers and fighters that said they made more money signing that game. Jake Shields probably made more money in one bombed version of the EA Sports video game than Carlos Condit did.
In 3 hit versions of the UFC.
Yeah, in 3 hit versions. And the reason was because he could negotiate his price. He didn't hand over the image rights to the UFC. The UFC was able to take the collective value of all the fighters, strike a great deal, and keep most of the money. And that's great for the UFC.
On top of that, too, for EA Sports, it was just rented. Their likeness rights weren't given up in perpetuity.
Yeah, because with THQ, THC, whatever it was, they went out of business, and the UFC took their video game. Now they're working with EA Sports.
Yeah.
And THQ didn't get to keep the likeness rights. That's portable. The UFC can cut all the deals at once and take those. They've still got John Fitch's likeness rights. They can take it wherever they want, forever.
But if you look at those are great examples of what happened in the past, and they present the argument that this is great for the fighters. We're doing this because, who's going to sell John Fitch's video rights? Well, yeah, maybe no one wants John Fitch's video game rights, but at the time, EA Sports, if they weren't handed them the rights by the UFC, they might have come around and go, listen, we need all the top 10 fighters in the game because people want to play the fighters, and the fighters' managers could have got together and negotiated much better deals for them. Same with the sponsor tax. It was sold as we're getting rid of the riff-raff sponsors, but I mean, I've talked to so many different managers and fighters about this. There's no way around it. It was devastating to them when that sponsor tax was put in. And a good example is look what happened to Strikeforce when the sponsor tax came out overnight. Connor Hewlin was talking about he made $16,000 on average per fight from sponsors before the tax, $3,000 after.
And that's brutal for somebody whose annual income is in the low five figures. I mean, if you're a fighter and you're lucky to net somewhere from 20 to 50 grand, maybe in an exceptional year, that's devastating.
Yeah, Tim Kennedy said he made the most money ever as a sponsor in Strikeforce, and ever since then, every fight since they got bought out, since the sponsor tax was implemented in Strikeforce, he's made less in sponsors every fight. Even though he's moved up the rankings, been in the UFC, gotten more exposure, he's making less.
And in fairness, I want to point out that that's not entirely a function of the sponsor tax. You also have the reality of the collapse of douche bro culture, the affliction and tap out fad that was a big part of the UFC's rise to fame and fortune. And from 2005 to 2009, 2010, crashed hard because every roided up tanning machine orange idiot in America was wearing a tap out and affliction shirt, mostly affliction shirts, it seemed like forever, and the backlash on that has been pretty hard. So you have a sport and an ethos that was very hip and very cool and something a lot of people wanted to spend quite a bit of money on before the economic bust and before the UFC's moved to Fox and subsequent decline in popularity. So it's not just the sponsor tax, it's also the function of a fad. The sizzle coming off a fad to some extent.
I mean, most guys give me three reasons. That's one, the fad ended. One, the sponsor tax, and then the third one is with the oversaturation element. That there's so many fights, so many fighters, that they're just a face in the crowd. What's the value in putting on one fight on a prelim on Macau fights? Who's watching that? So
telling a sponsor you're going to be aired on UFC Fight Pass, not very compelling. Brian, what do you think is behind how do you ascribe the decline in sponsor money? How much of the blame do you put on the fad? How much do you put on the sponsor tax? How much do you put on oversaturation?
Like John said, I don't know. I would put maybe if I wouldn't really want to give it percentages, but I would say the majority would be the tax. And then oversaturation of cards. Sponsors have a harder time picking individual fighters with stories and saying, oh, all right, we'll step behind this guy and because we'll get this kickback and exposure. So there's a lot of factors, the decline in the sport itself that needs to be mentioned, at least in terms of profits or viewership numbers. But mainly, there's lots of people who will put money in the sport or money in the fighters regardless of TV ratings or regardless of a lot of things, and they know they're not going to make any profit back. They know they're not going to sell enough T-shirts back to get what they paid. That's why I'm saying it's a betrayal. A company like Dethrone had an embryonic relationship with Cain Velasquez and Conor McGregor. And then when they eventually moved up and they couldn't pay those guys anymore. But they have guys they're close with, and those are the relationships that are going to be harmed here. Giving a guy a few bucks at the beginning of his career, supporting him with even just fight gear and stuff like that is going to make a huge difference. So we're seeing these relationships being eroded. The value of the money, the money doesn't matter so much as the relationships, in my opinion, because we could be talking about lifelong situations where there's some kickback for the fighter or a job down the line or some other benefits that we haven't even thought about.
And you mentioned the Dethrone comments, and let me run through these in depth because I think honestly these are the most informative comments that have been made by anybody. And this is from Nick Swimmen, who's the head of Dethrone and most famous and best known as the founder of Zappos.com, which he sold to Amazon for a gazillion dollars, I think over $1 billion. So this is a real player in the business world, and he formed Dethrone, I think mostly for fun. And so here's his 5 points about this. 1, we knew this was coming. We were not invested in a UFC future when we paid the sponsor tax each quarter. We were just paying for the right to be able to pay guys to wear our stuff on UFC broadcasts for the next 90 days. In some cases trying to support a good guy, sometimes trying to align ourselves with the fighter we hoped would move the needle, sometimes just trying to get airtime on a good card. Sometimes we couldn't figure out why we did it. Number 2, we have nothing negative or positive to say about the UFC. We don't really know anyone who works there and have never had any real interactions with anybody from the UFC other than from the annual email from Mike Mersch and Legal with renewal form for the sponsor tax. 3, we developed a lot of personal relationships with UFC fighters and their managers over the past 5 years and will always be rooting for those guys. 4, the good managers always get the short end of the stick. They provide a valuable service to their fighters, but unfortunately, it's in an ecosystem that would prefer they didn't exist. which makes their job difficult. It seems to be forgotten that this is their livelihood too. There are also dipshit managers who give everyone else a bad name. Before we go on to his 5th, 6th, and 7th points, let's talk about that. What does this mean for MMA managers, and what is the overall trend in the role of MMA managers? I mean, I can remember 10 years ago when somebody like Monty Cox, who handled the Pat Miletich, Matt Hughes, Stable, Tim Sylvia, all those champions that came out of Iowa, was a big player in the MMA scene. These days, you can think of Ed Soares, maybe a couple others, but what's the status of the MMA manager today? Where's it going, and what's this mean for the fighters? Brian, you go first.
Okay. Really good question. Back in the day, Monty Cox, they were competing organizations, so there could be counter offers and counter bids. But even with that, an interesting story is how Dana won't talk to him because of what happened with, was it Jens Pulver, where he went to Japan?
That's been that long that they're not talking? Yeah.
He got a good deal.
Yeah, so I mean, the role of the manager ideally should be picking like 2 different promotions or to find a way to increase the value of their fighter, like Customato did for Mike Tyson or Floyd Patterson. You know, finding alternative ways to showcase the fighter, putting them in fights to build their value up in the rankings and to get the highest purse available. But it's more like you can take what you can get. We're going to take what you can get now. And then managers are signing these long-term deals of 8 contracts, 10 fights, 12 fights, because then like they have paper that'll let them get their percentage for the duration of these deals. There's a lot of dirty reasons that this stuff is happening, and you know, it's kind of obscene, you know, that the managers aren't like vying for more rights. You got Ed Soares has a deal for the RFA, so he has his own promotion, and he's good with the UFC. So he supports their policy, but he doesn't get the best deals for his guys in terms of getting a cut from pay-per-view. So I'm saying like this is a whole betrayal of spirit. The role of the manager also could be to get sponsorships and shore those up. GSP's manager definitely brokered stuff. He signed with Creative Arts Agency to also get some sponsorship. But ultimately, you know, it's a diminished role now with these rules.
John, what do you think about this? I mean, what does he mean by an ecosystem that would prefer managers not exist? What does that even mean, and what does that mean for fighters?
I mean, I've talked to a lot of managers about this, and actually I hope to write an article on how management's basically going extinct in the UFC, but it's very hard to get people on the record. They'll tell you stories, but getting people on the record is very hard.
And let me jump in there because I want to add that you and Brent Brookhouse and other people, and I'm sure you were working on this too, everybody knew this uniform deal was coming, and nobody would talk about it, including all these companies that are about to be washed into oblivion by losing the sponsorship deal. It continues to amaze me, especially coming out of politics. Fighter managers, everybody in the fight world are the biggest bunch of wimps and pussies I've ever encountered on this planet. As far as, you know, if I was going to be a union smasher, smashing a nascent fighters union would be the easiest gig on earth. Anyway, go ahead, John.
It's been done a lot already. So, but that's why we love the Diaz brothers. They're the only ones that'll speak out. They might not sound the best when they say it, but they'll speak what's on their mind. They're great quote machines. But,
that's the one quote I should mention is Nate Diaz. This is the biggest traffic story of Bloody Elbow all week. He was like, he put out a tweet, you know, screw you and your bitch-ass uniforms. And a lot of people wanted to read what he had to say. I don't know what the impact of that is, but you know, here's a guy who's basically in open revolt against the UFC while he's under contract.
And then you look at the most honest, I guess the most open managers that they'll say stuff in public, what they'll say in private is like Monty Cox is pretty open when you talk to him, and Mike Cogan, which is probably why both of them are not really dealing with the UFC much anymore. But Monty
Cogan wasn't even allowed to be part of Nate Diaz's new deal.
Yeah, well, you know, they won't, like they give him the Monty treatment. They won't talk to him at all. So there's supposedly a lot of management that the UFC will not talk to, and they use go-betweens and on a bunch of other methods to keep working with the UFC. But going forward, I think a lot of management tell me this is basically the end. You know, that what is the purpose of management in the UFC in the future? You really have no negotiating leverage because it's almost impossible to negotiate using Bellator or another promotion as an option. So you're stuck with signing with the UFC. You have no leverage. You don't get to pick and choose when and where you fight as a manager. You have no say in that. You have now no sponsorship rights, and the UFC generally is going directly to the fighter, not even talking to you to negotiate pay with them.
Yeah, and a
So
lot of the payouts happen in the locker room where they keep the managers out after the fights, and they're dishing out checks like Santa Claus, supposedly, and have no
well, I mean it's
managers
smart of the
to pay
UFC. They
off.
go if a manager strikes a great deal with the UFC, if they use leverage and negotiate with another promotion and get a great deal, the UFC is just going to go up to the fighter and say, "Hey, why don't we just come to an agreement? Here's $1 million. We can't pay you this now, but we'll stretch it out over 5 years, and now you don't have to cut your manager in on that because you made the deal yourself."
Yeah,
And
and that was the rub of the lawsuit against Brandon Vera's manager that I think played a huge role in Brandon Vera's career never flourishing into what it could have been. The guy ended up spending 18 months on the shelf due to a management dispute that fundamentally boiled down to the manager cutting a pretty good deal for his fighter, or trying to, and then the UFC trying to cut the manager out of the deal by going directly to Brandon Vera, which in the short term might have benefited Brandon Vera in terms of he got a bigger slice of that pie. Long term, I don't think it was good for Brandon Vera. I'd be very curious to see what Vera has to say to that now. So if fighters don't have managers anymore, what about the competition? Is this an opportunity for Bellator? Will sponsors flock to Bellator fighters? Will young fighters be more interested in Bellator if they can make more money short term for sponsors? Brian, you want to go first?
Sure. The number one impediment here is the 1-year matching clause. And even if you're someone like the Throne, who do you want? Like some no names. Bellator has a lot of guys who no one's heard of, or a guy like who has potential to be a star. You want to bet on a racehorse that's going to win. And so I mean, it's a real crapshoot with fighters in general. So yeah, they could sponsor the Bellator guys right now for probably a lot cheaper without any of those restrictions. But even Bellator has requirements too. They don't want conflicting sponsors with their promotion. And with the 1-year matching clause, a guy like Gilbert
Explain
Melendez.
what the 1-year matching clause is.
So the UFC has the right to like match the fighter's salary for up to a year after their contract finishes. So a year and you're talking about 18 months of inactivity. A fighter would have to sit out for a year, basically to get free and clear of the UFC. Basically, that's what the Bellator guy,
Eddie Alvarez.
Eddie Alvarez could have done, but he didn't, and he got really embroiled in a shitstorm of a lawsuit. If he'd sat out, he would have been free and clear. And then, but Gilbert
If he
Melendez.
sat out for a whole year, which ended up sitting out more because of the lawsuit and everything. Gilbert Melendez, on the other hand, he went to Bellator and got an offer from Bellator, which the UFC then matched. And it was a great deal for Melendez from all accounts. But he didn't get to have an extended bidding war. Bellator got one bite at the apple, and then the UFC got one chance to match it, and that's end of discussion.
I think the dethroned guy mentioned this because he understands the sponsors have very limited leverage. The sponsors are just further victims because of everyone else's the shit that's happened to everybody else. It's just the trickle down. They're last on the food chain. UFC has the most power. The fighters themselves have some power they're not using, and the managers, and then the media is probably at the lowest of the totem pole, the pecking
Even
order.
below the sponsors?
Yes.
Come on. This is BloodyElbow.com. You're talking about one of the most storied in media. It hurts. It hurts. But yeah, it's pretty much true.
So I mean, we're talking about power that can't be utilized because of the way contracts are written, and that's smart for the promoter. They get to control the narrative. The narrative is that we owe the Fertittas everything because they invested, the millions in the sport. We're losing money. We owe them for life. We're indentured to them for life, and that narrative is a reinforcing narrative that's perpetually going back. They created the platform for this sponsorship. There would be no millions of dollars for these top elite athletes if it wasn't for the UFC, if it wasn't for the Fertittas. We keep coming back to that over and over and over again. So they've done a good job. That's one of the major consequences here from squeezing everybody.
And John, what do you think? Is this an opportunity for Bellator? Are we going to see an influx of talent and money coming into Bellator?
It's going to be kind of interesting because Bellator's they're trying to go off the Pride model, and which is they're running less shows consistently. Pride used to run 10 to 12 shows a year, basically once a month, get the consistent viewing audience, and they'd repeatedly show the same fighters with packages so you got to know them. And that seems to be Bellator's plan is going forward is run the Pride model, run 12, 16 shows a year, and get guys on the screen 3, 4 times a year and get you used to them. And so if it works, those fighters are going to be they're going to have name value more than a general UFC fighter. UFC fighter is going to have the UFC cachet that they're in the UFC, but a Bellator fighter, at least you might recognize them. That's their plan. It'll be interesting to see if it works. I don't know if it will. I don't know if but it'll be interesting if it does. Melendez
are very interesting because Bellator's, Bellator 131 did very well in the ratings, and this follows what was a Bellator 120 that had the promo for the Bonner-Tito fight that was consummated at 131, also did very well. And when you look at the numbers that UFC is pulling on Fox Sports 1, much less Fox Sports 2, suddenly it's a very different proposition, and it'll be very interesting to see if Bellator can do numbers that compete with the numbers UFC is pulling on Fox. Does that change the whole dynamic of the sport? I mean, what does it take for the UFC to not be the #1 promotion anymore?
Well, UFC is going to be the #1 for until something, until we get a black swan event and it changes everything. But I don't see them being toppled. I mean, a lot of guys in Bellator can tell you they're not or a lot of managers, fighters. Bellator's not real competition in the sense that they're going up against the UFC to take over. I mean, Strikeforce was much closer to actual competition. Look at the talent level they had. Bellator, though, could be an option. It's an option for fans that want to watch something different than the UFC. It's an option for fighters, hopefully, going forward if they don't like what the UFC is offering.
It certainly seems to be a place to earn money after you've retired from the UFC.
Yeah, well, we'll see how long that goes. I think they do want to go after younger guys, and I think that's why they're leaking stuff that they're, that even guys like Brock or any fighter, Coker has been out there saying stuff like, we will go after everybody that's a needle mover. I think they're hoping guys will test the market because they'd love to grab a few UFC guys. It brings attention. But Melendez was a special case. It's going to be very hard. I don't think fans quite understand how restrictive MMA contracts are and just how difficult, if a promotion does not want to let you go, how difficult it is to really test the free market. I mean, you can test it, but they'll make sure they strip as much value from you before you get on the market.
And this is where the Muhammad Ali Act for boxing explicitly forbids so many of these practices, but only in boxing, not in MMA. And it sort of boggles the mind. If it's bad for a promoter to entangle a boxer in endless contracts and obligations, why is it fine and dandy for the UFC to entangle a fighter in endless obligations and champions clauses and things where they can't get out? Is it just because John McCain's from Nevada and so's Zuffa and everything's hunky-dory there, or what?
I don't have an answer. It is weird how fans will say that, like, boxing's so corrupt and the stuff's terrible in boxing, and then we get to MMA. No, don't touch that. You can't. We love the way that works. Well, that's the stuff they were doing in boxing that people made the Muhammad Ali Act for. I mean, there's controlling a belt. I guess the biggest thing Muhammad Ali Act would do, and I was talking to Leon Margalis, the promoter, about that, is probably divide the promotions from the sanctioning body. And I don't think that's another thing. I don't think fans quite understand the power a promotion has when they control who owns the belt.
And let's get to this. They're saying that the fighter's share of the Reebok pie is going to be determined by the rankings. Now, the rankings are currently determined by a pretty, and not to cast stones, but a pretty amateurish pack of journalists kind of picked at random, voting with no real clear criteria. So you get things like fighters lose a fight and go up in the rankings routinely, and so they claim they're going to straighten it out and have a smaller pool of more credible journalists voting in the rankings body. But Brian, is there any way the UFC can control a rankings panel, and that rankings panel then produce fair rankings that are equitable, especially when fighters' money is being determined by it?
All right, first little correction. There was a lot of high-level journalists who used to participate in those rankings, right?
Yeah. That's.
And then they dropped off,
including several Bloody Elbow writers. I'm not casting any aspersions on anybody.
And then they dropped off because it was extra work, right? It was extra work to go in and do this.
And also, it was a conflict of interest for some people.
Right, and Ariel Helwani, I think, bowed out early and said, this is a conflict of interest. So this time around, it's fascinating because Dana looks at the thing he created and says, "This is shit." The people we have doing it right now are garbage, and we want good people to actually do the rankings now and invest their time and energy. But like Dana's very much, the UFC is very much like a player. When he gets something, he conquers it and he tarnishes it, and he doesn't want it because he has it.
Ouch! So, that is a stone cold metaphor for the UFC. I saw, I conquered, I came. as Pitbull. Look at me with the Pitbull references. I went to the skating rink the other week and heard them hit. But anyway, go ahead.
So whoever he gets, he's going to end up disparaging. It's a lose-lose proposition. He could get Josh Gross, or he could get Ariel Helwani.
Ha ha ha!
I
mean, this is Josh Gross, is somebody who won't even has basically been driven out of writing about the sport. The most storied journalist in MMA history now can't get creds, can't get a job. Adios.
But he'll whoever does it, he'll still be telling them what the rankings should be, as he's been doing consistently since the UFC started rankings. So it won't be a fair system regardless. And we got to go by past examples. Like, this relationship is not going to turn around. It's like when you've been with someone and they've treated you a certain way for so many years, you have to let go of any hope of fairness arriving. So the system will be rigged one way or another, or it'll be influenced. And MMA journalists aren't the people to be in charge of something like that.
Yes,
and then the ones who could do it will not be invited to do it.
Yeah. John, do you have any comments on the rankings panel?
I despise the UFC rankings. Just when you see, from the very beginning, I was upset when people were participating, because if you look at, it's a negotiating tool. If everybody's paying attention just to the UFC rankings, then guys like Ben Askren don't matter. They're not ranked. Nate Diaz can complain about his contract. Oh, he's not ranked. John Fitch, Okami, drop them. They're not ranked. They don't matter. It's not only does it affect guys' pay, or in the future will affect their sponsorship pay. It already affects people's pay based on the fact of who's ranked and who's not. The UFC decides who's on the list, who's not.
Yeah.
And I don't think any media member should be taking part in that. You know.
I have to concur. It's the whole thing is a mess and an ugly thing, and it's the company door.
I'll defend UFC on one point of that. Suppose it wasn't their idea to come up with. This was a Fox idea.
Fox wanted rankings just as a way to enhance the narrative and the storytelling. Who are these guys and why do they matter?
But when you're a company that controls the sport as much as the UFC, if you're that powerful, no matter what, things get tainted even when they're not your idea. When you're just even when you're trying to do the right thing, the UFC does what they're asked. It can become corrupted by.
There are already a lot of rankings. There are Fight Magazine rankings with a computerized system. You know, there are different credible journalists who people and fans liked, who had rankings people respected.
I got to put in a plug for the old Bloody Elbow USA Today rankings, which aggregated all the rankings from every credible source we could get, put it together, weighed it by how many fighters were ranked on each panel, and put it out there. But business is business. That deal fell apart with the UFC and the USA Today and MMA Junkie. And the UFC relationship, and honestly, from my perspective, the UFC has no interest in independent rankings. They want rankings they can control, and they're dipping their hand in there even deeper. So, it is what it is. I don't think it's good for the fighters. I don't think it's good for the sport. So, one last point before we get towards wrapping this up. So another rumor that from the infamous UFC shill, suspected UFC shill, and great guy and informative commentator MMA Logic, he popped into the Dethroned thread on MMA.tv to add, just out of the blue, as if he knows, which sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't, that there's going to be slots on these uniforms for other sponsors. And his statement was that these other sponsors, that money will all go to Zuffa. That money will not go. None of that money will go to the fighters. So the fighters will participate in the Reebok money, and then from there, it's Zuffa taking another selling opportunity. A, do you think this is going to happen? Does this sound real? And B, what are the implications of this? John, you go first.
Well, I could see it happening. I doubt it's going to be 100%. They'll give a little bit just to mask it or whatever, but that sounds about right. The sponsorship tax happened. It was sold as an idea that's going to help the fighters and get out the riffraff. Really, it was an attempt of the UFC to get their hand on some of that sponsor revenue coming through. If this does go through, you got to start adding it together. The fighters were organized into a collective body, much like an association or union, by the UFC, and negotiated with the sponsor, with the fighters not participating, to strike a deal where they got supposedly 100% of the first sponsor, then 0 of the second and third. So really, they're striking a deal where they're going to get 30%, maybe if there's a fourth sponsor, 20, 25% of the total revenue. But they were used as a collective body. And think how much money they could have got if the fighters could have organized and collectively bargained themselves. for that amount of money.
What are you, Leon Trotsky over here?
Yeah, I'm a yeah.
This
It's gonna be
sounded
off.
pretty pink.
I'll be looking and I'll be buried under the new LA football stadium when they build it. So
There's an ice pick waiting for you, Kami, I'll tell you.
yeah.
All right, Brian,
But
what do you think about this idea? Is this a de facto company union that the UFC's put together, and what, if anything, can fighters do about it?
This is like The Godfather, where Fanucci is going around to different merchants in Little Italy and taking money out of their pockets. And
Offering protection and keeping the stores safe.
that's right. Um, what John said, to follow up on that, this collective thing, I heard Kevin Iole tell Josh Gross that, well, George St. Pierre's interests differ completely with an undercard fighter who makes a few thousand. That's why an association won't work. John just explained exactly what an MMA association would do, why it will work, because we're talking about this is revenue independent of a fighter's purse or salary or division of pay-per-view revenue. This is millions of dollars revenue available for all kinds of fighters, to get from sponsors, which they can negotiate, individualize, personalize, video game likeness rights. There's all kinds of streams and benefits of an association. The only discussion that needs to happen at this point isn't why a union wouldn't work, but explaining how it should happen, how it should be made reality. Because a lot of the points people are making against it are incoherent arguments, like what Iole said. No disrespect, he's a great reporter in some respects, but I don't understand how anyone could misconstrue what John just said. That the fighters themselves could have gone to any company in the world and said, give us some money and we'll do this for you. And then they could have strengthened their position, and then maybe they could have got some of the pay-per-view money, which a lot of even elite guys like John Jones or Chris Weidman probably don't get the cut they would get if they were boxers, because they just don't have any tools.
Yeah, I definitely agree. They do not get anything like the kind of money that Pacquiao and Mayweather are talking about. If that fight ever comes together.
What about Kovalev? And he's got a fight coming up. He's splitting a purse of $6 million.
Yeah, and it's very clear if you look at the top tier of boxers and the top tier of MMA fighters that the boxers are making way more money. And to me, it's like, at what point does somebody like John Jones or Cain Velasquez wake up to the fact that they could have been making in the tens of millions and they're making in the single millions?
But it's mid-tier boxers too who are making a lot of money.
Yes.
And that needs to be remembered. If the lowest tier boxers don't make a lot of money, it's because they're basically the same as low tier MMA fighters. Where's the value in them? How many tickets do they sell, right? If you can sell tickets and generate pay-per-view, then you have value, and that revenue is what we're discussing, how it should be split up. And again, but the narrative right now will be the UFC will say, well, we brokered this deal. We improved the sport. We made it really professional. We gave you guys these uniforms. And they have the narrative that, well, you weren't getting shit for sponsorship anyways. We rescued you guys. They rescued these guys from a problem they created partially with the sponsorship tax, right? So they're really smart in controlling this whole thing.
Yep, and all right, let's wrap this up. So we've got two commies here on the panel who say socialism is good. You've got me waving the flag and saying socialism is bad. Dana White's your corporate father. Do what you're told. Shut up. Get the monies that he's so generously handing out, and be happy that you can even put on the gloves, the storied UFC gloves, and not at any sort of personal promotional appearance, only when you're doing UFC official appearances. So, final thoughts, John.
Well, yeah, you summed it up nicely there. I just think it's going to be the same boat as before. I guess we do have to. It's smart of them to leak just a little bit of information, because we do have to take a wait and see attitude, because you really don't know the details. Who knows? But if you had to guess, you would think this is going to follow the path of the previous incidents that happened. So my final thoughts would be.
So you're saying it's a heads, Zuffa wins, tails, the fighters lose kind of deal?
I mean, no matter what, yeah, the fighters might win, the fighters might lose, but Zuffa's definitely going to win. I mean, it's their deal. They struck it. I think the smartest thing they did is they went and got all the champs signed to Reebok before the deal was announced, because the champs, the most important people who would probably be complaining the most about this, are now out there, celebrating the fact that Reebok's coming into the cage. And if they talk to the fighters, supposedly they talked to a lot of fighters before this deal was announced, but if Uriah Faber was one of them, and all the questions he had, it doesn't sound like they had that much input. So I guess my final thought is this is just business, I guess. I mean, what's the difference between UFC and Amazon and Uber
Walmart.
and Walmart? It's the modern America corporate culture. So.
Squeeze every dime out of everybody at every angle. And Brian, your final thoughts?
I'm going to take a different angle here as an artist. You know, when I saw Mike Tyson fight in his black shorts, I knew I wanted to be exactly like that. That's what makes someone a fan, the fighter's individual identity, that they're special. There's something unique about this guy. Or Apollo Creed in his American flag shorts. You take that away, no matter how they personalize this. The fans are gonna feel that. I don't know if they'll see it or analyze why they don't like the sport anymore. And people are saying, I don't like MMA. There's something about it that's just turning people off now. But it's a really bad energy that you have quote unquote fighters and they aren't even like individuals. So there's nothing to really inspire me. The more I see fighters go along, the less I'm inspired to like follow them or tell their stories or want to be a part of this thing, and many media members are saying the same thing. So I mean, how can we really have respect? Tyson had a lot of fans because he constantly bucked convention. He made himself a star. It's not about sponsorship necessarily, the stuff I'm talking about, but it's about a question of identity, and that's what's really being taken away. And Zuffa is completely colonizing the fighters or the industry from taking away photographers' rights, and outsourcing everything. Everything goes through Getty for image rights, media credentials. So it's like the Native Indians or something like that. You colonize, you take away their turf, you take away their voice. What are you replacing it with?
And you bring civilization and progress and immunization
and some blankets.
It is pretty fascinating about this is that if you were looking for evidence of monopoly monopsony or antitrust by the UFC, remember when I talked to Thuggus and Gift, one of the ideas we got to look at is what is a company doing that they couldn't do in a competitive market? In a competitive market, would fighters agree to wear a uniform and get rid of the regular sponsors? In a competitive market, would fighters sign to a promotion that has sponsor tax? In a competitive market, would fighters give up their image rights?
The counter you're going to hear to that is that they do it in NFL, they do it in NCAA. This is professional sports. It's a big-time organization.
But they're not competitive markets. Everybody knows they have antitrust exempts because they have association and unions. In a competitive market, does any athlete, fighter sign it? Compared to boxing, does anyone sign a 10, 12 fight contract that's one-sided, that you can be cut by one party? I mean, that does not sound like. So if you're looking for evidence, here's another thing you can bring up and go, oh my God.
Well, good thing nobody's looking for that kind of troublemakers or radicals out there.
But the 40 people that read some I write might be looking at it, and that's.
I see. Well, thanks guys for being on the show. It will be very interesting to see what goes on. As always, give us a like on YouTube. Subscribe to MMANation.com on YouTube. Read us at BloodyElbow.com. You can also read Brian at Cage Potato. Anywhere else you're being featured these days?
No. I'm working on a novel.
All right, and you will be sure to tell us all about that when that comes out. And you're at Thracian Books, is that correct for your Twitter handle?
Thracian_books.
Thracian_books. And come up with a harder to spell and remember one, and I'll definitely be pushing that one. And John, you are what on Twitter again?
Oh, Hey Not the Face.
At Hey Not the Face. Again, kids, these are lessons in how not to build a personal brand. Go with.
What do you mean? Hey, that's right there. That's very sellable. It's honest advertising.
And I'm at Kid Nate, although I rarely tweet. Read me at BloodyElbow.com. We'll be back with a 6th round post-fight show after UFC 181 Saturday night. Eugene Robinson will be back with Knuckle Up on Monday morning, and then we'll move on down the road with the whole usual panoply of previews and blather you know and love from us. Adios, MMA aficionados. Thanks for watching.